Well, as I said, my name is Peter Gurry, and it's my privilege to introduce our third and final main speaker today. His name is Dr. Daniel B. Wallace. Students of Greek all over the country and all over the world know him for his advanced Greek grammar. I know him for that as well. He did not have a hot seat, at least wasn't called that, but he certainly did have a hot seat, and I was in it more times than I wanted to be in his advanced Greek grammar class as well. And it's a great privilege for me to introduce him because Dan is very much the reason that I do what I do at the seminary. I teach New Testament, and my specialty is textual criticism. And back when I was in Bible college, a very important book came out that was a New York Times bestseller by a scholar named Bart Ehrman, who you may have heard of. And the book was Misquoting Jesus, and Dan Wallace wrote one of the best responses to that book. And I, as an undergraduate, read that book, and I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. And so I worked hard in Bible college and then went to Dallas Seminary where Dan teaches. And I went there in the hopes that maybe I could get in his class and maybe I could become an intern at his Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, which I hope you visited their booth out here in the back. If you haven't, go see them, please. And I thought maybe if I could go on a trip with him, I could see a real New Testament manuscript. And in God's kindness, within about a year of being at Dallas Seminary, I had met Dr. Wallace. I had taken him for a class, and I had joined the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts, and it was about a year later that I was on a trip with him, and I've now been on 3 or 4 trips with him and with his center to digitally preserve our incredible collection around the world of New Testament manuscripts. So we have Dan and his team to thank for the fact that scholars like me and anybody can access high-quality digital images online at their website at csntm.org for free. So we can thank Dan and his teams for doing that. Dan is a husband to Patty and a father to 4 boys, Noah, Benjamin, Andrew, and Zachary. And there's a lot more I could say about Dan, but I want you to hear directly from him now. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Wallace?
Thanks, Peter. I didn't know that story about you reading that. Yeah. Good morning. I was told I have 95 minutes, and then we'll take a 5-minute break, and then 2 hours after that. Thank you for that introduction, Peter. I appreciate that. In fact, I can hardly wait to hear what I have to say after that kind of an introduction. But I need to say, you got the names of my boys all wrong. I don't know how you did that. My wife and I have been married for 45 years. We're a very godly couple. And the proof of that is we named all of our children after people in the Bible, but not Noah, Benjamin, Andrew, and Zachary. We named them after characters in one chapter of the Bible, Revelation chapter 6, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So their names are death, pestilence, famine, and disease. And it's been really a very sad thing that every once in a while when I go to speak, death comes with me. But as you can also see just by looking at me, famine and I have never had much of a relationship. So. The previous 2 speakers just gave great lectures, really profound information, and I deeply appreciate what Dr. Dempster and Dr. Gentry had to say and the level of scholarship that they've done over the years. It's just been phenomenal. I hope you deeply appreciated what you were getting because this is just absolutely top-notch stuff. And they are both very absent-minded professors. I, on the other hand, am not at all. Peter, what time was I supposed to finish? And this is Tucson we're at, right? Okay. Anyway. It was in the 9th century at a scriptorium near Dublin in a monastery in Kilkenny, about 100 miles away, that a young man by the name of Andrew was a new monk, and he started copying out the text as they did in these scriptoria, and it was a text actually in English. And so he got to be so good at his scribal duties that the abbot said, well, I think you could do some more work here. And he continued to work on these manuscripts. And finally, when he graduated from this it was kind of like a seminary, I guess. He got a letter of introduction from the abbot to go to another monastery where he would be a scribe full time. And so he gets to this other monastery with this letter of introduction. This is how people always used to travel, a sealed letter of introduction. And so when the abbot at this new monastery opened it, he said, okay, let me take a look here, and said, this man is very particular. In fact, we might want to call him anal. Is that okay to say here? Oh, it's not a Southern Baptist school, so I guess it's all right. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Peter, where'd Peter go? I had to do that to you. So the abbot said, well, I think what this man should do is copy out the text. So he assigned Brother Andrew to start copying out manuscripts, and it was manuscripts of the monastery laws, the bylaws. And as he got into this, about a half hour later, he comes over and knocks on the door of the abbot and says, Holy Father, there seem to be some discrepancies here. Can I get some older manuscripts? And so the abbot showed him to another room and said, yeah, these are pretty rare. Go ahead and you can copy those. Just be really careful. I've never let a new monk copy these older manuscripts. In fact, almost nobody here has ever even seen them. So he starts copying these out. About 45 minutes go by. He goes back to the abbot's office, knocks on the door. Holy Father, there still seem to be some discrepancies. They're not copied very carefully. And so he said, is there anything that's older? And the abbot said, well, actually, we do have the original bylaws written some time ago, centuries ago, hidden in a vault, and nobody has seen them since they were copied one time way back then. But I think you can be able to handle this. And so just be really careful with these documents. So he took him down to this vault, a serpentine path in the bowels of the monastery, and Brother Andrew started to copy. And about 20 minutes later, there were 15 pairs of hands pounding on the abbot's door. Holy Father, this new monk has gone berserk. So they all rush down this serpentine path, get down to the bowels of the monastery in this archive room, and Brother Andrew is pounding his fist on the desk. And he's saying, they left out the letter R. They left out the R. And the abbot thought, this guy really is anal. He said, what do you mean? The word is supposed to be celebrate. Some of these folks over here still haven't gotten it. Are you wildcats by any chance? Sun Devils rock. All right. Title of my lecture is What We Have Now, What They Wrote Then. We're dealing with the text of the New Testament. And let me start by giving some quotes of skeptics, and we'll start with that great scholar, Dan Brown, in his book, The Da Vinci Code, where he says, the Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. Well, you've all heard that. You go to Starbucks, you go work out at the gym, you do whatever you do in Phoenix because the sun is always shining and you don't have the humidity that we have in Dallas, so you actually get to be outside and enjoy it. I'm sorry, I was just complaining. But you talk to people. Oh yeah, the Bible's been translated and retranslated so many times we can't possibly get back to the original. That's kind of been the theme that we've been addressing this weekend, isn't it? In fact, last night when John Meade got up to speak, he quoted from Kurt Eichenwald. I didn't know he was going to steal my thunder, but I'm going to do it anyway again. This is in an article in Newsweek, which purportedly is actual news, facts. And notice he published this on December 23rd in 2014. These articles, these radio interviews, these TV shows always come out at Christmas and Easter, basically to say, Christians, just give it up. And so he wrote this article, The Bible So Misunderstood, It's a Sin. And in this book, or in this article, he said, he talked about the game Playing Telephone with the Word of God. And here's what he says, what John Meade said last night, but it's worth saying again, because I didn't want to take this slide out. And anyway. No television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope. Neither have I. So far, I probably would agree with all that. And neither have you. At best, we've all had a bad translation, a translation of translations of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on hundreds of times. What's interesting is that Eichenwald has used a source, and we'll show you what that source is, where he has actually played the telephone game with this written source to come up with this kind of a statement, which is not even close to what was originally uttered. He got the whole thing really garbled. But let's look at somebody who may be a little bit more academic, at least purports to be. This is C.J. Werleman. He wrote a book, Jesus Lied. He was only human. Here he is, hooked up to a lie detector. And he's an atheist. His first book, he likes to write provocatively titled books. His first book was called God Hates You, Hate Him Back. And I think that's a rather ironic title for a book by an atheist. Maybe, you know, he should have titled it something like Nothing Hates You, Hate Nothing Back, but that probably wouldn't go quite so well. So here's what he has to say. We do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. Well, he's not a biblical scholar, though. Where's he getting this information? He's not getting it from a popular apologist in Britain for the Islamic faith, but this is perhaps the most challenging of these statements by non-biblical scholars. M.M. al-Azami has done a lot for the Muslim faith in Britain, and he wrote a book called A History of the Quranic Text from Revelation to Compilation, and then he compares it with the Old and New Testaments. He said, the Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, and by that he doesn't mean the Greek Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox, he means what we would today call Orthodox with a small o. That is the essentials of the Christian faith that even Catholics, that Orthodox and evangelical Protestants believe about the death and bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that his death in some sense atoned for sins. And also, most importantly, that the death of this one was the death of the theanthropic person, the God-man. And so he says, this Orthodox Church stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God but a man, Docetism, the opposite view that he was God and not man, and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. The significance of this is that Muslims throughout the world believe this myth, that in the 4th century, at the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine commissioned the church to create the deity of Christ, as well as a bunch of other things that they basically believe. But he's not a biblical scholar either. Where do these people get this from? Well, Peter Gurry mentioned Bart Ehrman and his book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. Bart is a biblical scholar. He's a bona fide textual critic, and he's a longtime friend. I've known him for 38 years. Yeah, at least 38 years so far. Bart went to Moody Institute in Chicago. That's where, Peter, you went, right? So we're wondering what's going to happen to you in a few years. And then he graduated from Wheaton College, another fine evangelical school, went on to Princeton Seminary to study under Bruce Metzger, a brilliant New Testament textual critic, perhaps the best textual critic of the 20th century, and a solid evangelical. While Bart was in his master's program, he got an MDiv then, he was still an evangelical. I met him in his first year of the doctoral program, and he said, I've abandoned inerrancy, but I'm still an evangelical. Well, he got his doctorate under Bruce Metzger in textual criticism, and Metzger told me that his master's thesis and doctoral dissertations were the finest he had ever seen in his 46 years of teaching. That's pretty high praise. In fact, Metzger believed in Ehrman so much that he and Bart Ehrman co-authored the 4th edition of the standard text of the New Testament that Bruce Metzger had originally written in 1964. This came out in 2005. So after a few years, Bart kept moving further and further and further to the left, until in the year 2005, just weeks after this 4th edition of the Metzger-Ehrman textbook came out, Misquoting Jesus was published, and it really discouraged Bruce Metzger to see this. Perhaps what discouraged him also was that here it's Misquoting Jesus, but it has Hebrew in the background, not Greek, and it's upside down. I don't think Bart had anything to do with the cover. He actually wanted to have Lost in Transmission as the title, but I thought that Barnes & Noble would put it in the automotive section, so that really is true. So a few weeks after this book came out, which is really trying to discourage you from thinking that we have a reliable text, he was on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show. And on that show, Stewart interviewed him and he said, man, I want to congratulate you. This is one hell of a book, which is a really interesting adjective to use for a book about Jesus. Within 2 days, Misquoting Jesus was perched atop Amazon books, #1. Within 3 months, it sold 100,000 copies. It has affected students in colleges throughout the country. Bart Ehrman has become the #1 skeptic against Christianity in this country, at least. And today he claims to be an agnostic atheist. It depends how you want to define the terms. So he continues to move further and further to the left. And so what he says is, not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the originals, or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. We know where C.J. Werleman got his stuff from. It's right from this book. Then at the end of the book, Ehrman says, the more I study the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realize just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them. This is what M.M. al-Azami was saying. So here's a bona fide scholar who's making these claims, and I will tell you later about an updated edition of his book that was a paperback. That's going to be at the end of the lecture, but stay tuned. I'm going to quote Bart again a couple of times. It's always fun. But here's how I want to begin this. By the way, my lectures tend to have a preface that's about 3/4 of the lecture, and then we get into the meat of it. Now, this is very much like the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's 2 attitudes to avoid, and that was probably one of them. The first is radical skepticism. These people have said, there's no way we can get back to the original. Forget about it. The Bible has been changed. And as was pointed out earlier, what Satan said, what the serpent said in the garden, that first question was, has God really said? Has now become the fundamental question in apologetics today. It is a pre-apologetic question, because before you can even talk about what the Bible says, what the Bible teaches, you have to first establish, is this really what it says? So textual criticism is pre-evangelism, if you will. So this first attitude to avoid is radical skepticism. The empirical, rational basis for it is ridiculously weak. But the other attitude to avoid is absolute certainty, and this is what I suspect most of you may succumb to more easily. In my teaching career, which has now spanned about 35 years, I have lectured all over the country, and there are two states, Ohio and Texas, where I have met people who honestly believe and have said, if the King James Bible was good enough for St. Paul, it's good enough for me. Now, in Ohio, I'm not sure how to respond to that, but in Texas, what I say is, I want to pitch the conversation at a level that they can grasp. And I said, well, how about them Cowboys? And that's where we go. But you come to church, you bring your Bible, you call it the Word of God, which it is, but is every word in it the words of God? And to that, I can say no, it's not. What we have is, let's say you use the 2011 NIV, but before that you used the 1984 version of the NIV. Even if the English translation was exactly mapped the way the ancient languages did, so that there would be nothing lost in translation, everything would be exactly the same, we'd have to say one of these two cannot be the Word of God in every respect, because their word changes. What about the New American Standard Bible that came out in 1970, then the revision in 1995? What about the ESV that first, when it came out, said we will never change the text? And then weeks later they said, okay, we will change the text because we have to keep up with the English language and recognize that there's scholarship that is helping us to understand things differently. Even the King James Bible itself went through 3 major revisions that included over 100,000 changes, almost all of them minor, little spelling differences, but they were still changes to the text. So when somebody says, the King James Bible, that is absolutely the Word of God in every single respect, I ask, which King James Bible is it you're using? It's inevitably the 1769, but we won't get into that. They don't know that. But this is the danger that you all have. If you have absolute certainty, you're going to come crashing down, because you might think in every single detail what you have in your hands today is the Word of God. So where between these two extremes should we live? Radical skepticism, absolute certainty. I'm going to try to present a via media that moves a little bit closer to one side than the other. So there's 4 questions I want to answer. We're still in the preface. Did you know that? How many textual variants are there? What kinds of textual variations are there? One has to do with the number, the other has to do with the nature. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? And has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? Those are the 2 attitudes to avoid. These are the 4 questions to answer. And so we're ready to get actually into the main part of the lecture. Oh no, there's another preliminary question. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? No, we don't. It was written on papyrus, and if we had an original copy, it's not a copy if it's an original, but an original manuscript of the New Testament, one of the letters, one of the Gospels, we would probably know it. For one thing, it would be written on a scroll instead of a codex. The codex are modern book form where it's cut on one side and then you have cut pages. I mean, it's sewed in on one side, cut pages, then you open. If you're over 30, you've seen a codex. If you're under 30, you've never seen a codex, because the only books you've ever seen are on your computer, and you've gone retro on us. You scroll. I mean... So I'll try to introduce you to a modern invention and when it came about. These manuscripts got copied and copied and copied. And Ehrman is quite right that we don't have the originals. We don't have copies of the originals. But what's interesting is these originals lasted for several decades. And several people copied them and then made copies that went on. And then others might go back and say, somebody says, you know, I've got this copy of the letter to the Romans, and it's not exactly like this other one. I'm going to be in Rome next week. Let me see if I can look at that original. So they made these corrections. And that's how the gospel spread. That's how the New Testament spread. The copies would have just fallen apart before the year 200, almost certainly. So we don't have the originals anymore. Okay, we don't have the originals, but we got lots of copies, right? Yeah, we do. If they all agreed with each other, I guess we'd have to say, well, that's probably what the original says. We can't make any decisions otherwise, but that's not the case. In reality, in the first 8 centuries of the copying of the New Testament, we have between 6 and 10 variations per chapter between the 2 closest manuscripts. Now, you extrapolate that out over the whole New Testament, you got 2,500, 3,000 changes. So because of the disappearance of the originals, and because of the disagreements among the copies, we have to do what's called textual criticism. Okay, last preliminary question, I think. What is a textual variant? It's any place among the manuscripts in which there is variation in wording, including word order, omission, or addition of words, even spelling differences. That counts as a textual variant. Now, let me just tell you there are 138,162 words in the Greek New Testament, and don't ask me how I know that. My first game to Chavez Ravine, where the Los Angeles Dodgers were playing, it was a doubleheader. It was back in 1960, I think. At the end of the twilight doubleheader, my dad took me home. He said, well, what'd you think of the game? I said, I'm not sure. But did you know that there's 155,800 lights in this stadium, and 361 of them are burned out? That's the last time he took me to a baseball game. So don't ask me how I know how many words are in the Greek New Testament. However, about 138,000. Bart Ehrman likes to say we have more variants than we have words in the New Testament, and that's one of the few understatements he has made. We have textual variants in the manuscripts. Peter Gurry actually has done absolutely the best work on this in a scholarly journal, and he said there's about 500,000 textual variants, but he was not counting spelling variants. So those are about 2/3 of it. So my estimate is we have about 10 times as many textual variants as we do words in the New Testament. That's great news. My time is up. Let's close in prayer, shall we? The reason we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. If we had one manuscript, it would not disagree with itself, no variants. As soon as you add a second one, you're going to have differences, and a third, and a fourth, and a 10th, and a 1,000th. These manuscripts go all over the map, but the most common textual variant is one of spelling. But we have a lot of manuscripts. In fact, here's what the count looks like. Greek manuscripts today, there are known, the official count is 5,898. There's reasons why we shouldn't get too precise on that, because the official count is not the actual count. There's been manuscripts that have been found to be parts of others, and some have been lost, things like that. So we can adjust it to about 5,500. So if you're at Starbucks tomorrow and somebody says, did you know that there's 5,898 Greek New Testament manuscripts in existence today? You say, well, that really is not quite. It's really closer to 5,500. I'm sure that question will be asked at Starbucks by the barista. We have more manuscripts in Latin than in Greek. The New Testament was originally written in Greek. And late 2nd, perhaps early 3rd century, it started to get copied in Latin. And Latin swept across Europe to the west, so that became the lingua franca out of which many European languages came. Greek has no descendants. The best guess is we have about 10,000 copies of Latin manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, the vast majority of these, both in Greek and Latin, are not complete copies of the New Testament. And yet, the average size manuscript is over 400 pages long. This best guess, 10,000, we just haven't counted them all. We just don't know. That's a guess, and it's probably within a couple thousand right either way. But then the New Testament was translated into other ancient versions, especially Syriac and Coptic, two very early and very important manuscripts, or versions, translations, and then a number of others like Old Church Slavonic and Gothic and Georgian and Armenian. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 10,000 copies in these ancient versions. Again, we just don't know. So altogether, we probably have well over 20,000 copies of the New Testament in handwritten manuscripts before the time of the printing press. That's called an embarrassment of riches. But what if you had a magic wand and you could wipe all those out in one fell swoop? Well, we still would not be without a witness, because we have quotations from the New Testament by church fathers who wrote homilies and commentaries and theological treatises and letters to people. And they did not have the gift of brevity. They quoted and quoted and quoted the New Testament, so that today we have well over 1 million quotations by these church fathers. Now, it has often been said that we have the entire New Testament in the writings of the church fathers by the end of the 3rd century, except for 11 verses. That is a myth. It was based on faulty hearing from somebody at a party in the 1820s, I think. But to our shame, it was a Muslim apologist who discovered this. It's not through the 3rd century. We're talking about church fathers well into the 2nd millennium. About the 13th century is what we're counting, but we've got a long ways to go to even get into the 2nd millennium. But here's what I can say about the church fathers. We have virtually, and every word in this is important, we have virtually the entire New Testament in the writings of the church fathers multiplied many times over. Virtually the entirety of the New Testament in the writings of the church fathers multiplied many times over. So we still would not be left without a witness. Well, let's compare this to the average classical work. Greek or Latin authors are the ones we're talking about. The average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his work still in existence. And remarkably, it's been Christian monks that have preserved them, largely. And yet, we're typically waiting over 1,000 years before we see a single copy. Well, if you had these writings of one classical author, we'll just take an average author, and we stack them up, they'd be about 4 feet high, about right here. Let's compare that to the New Testament. So the average classical author, well, we can say about the height of a podium. This will do. The New Testament, what can we use in comparison? How about the Empire State Building in New York City? Now, for you wildcats, I had to add the location. Do we have any U of A alumni here? Oh, you're over there, okay. I will tell my jokes more slowly then, for your sake. Now, this is not to scale. Let me show something that is to scale. Let's see if we can get this right. Here's that podium. It's a pixel, 4 feet high. That's the right ratio. Here's the Empire State Building, 1,454 feet high. But gosh, I got a lot of extra room here. Is it one Empire State Building? No. The New Testament, if we stacked up all these handwritten copies, not counting the quotations from the church fathers, we would stack up 1, 2, 3, 4.5 Empire State Buildings over 1.25 miles high, 6,600 feet tall. Average classical author, 4 feet tall, 1.25 miles high for the New Testament. That's a huge difference. And people say, well, you know, we're waiting, we don't even have copies of the New Testament. You know what? When these authors like C.J. Werleman say, sometimes we're waiting for the 20th generation of copies. That's not true for the New Testament. He just made that one up. But it really is true for almost all classical authors. Now, let me give you some more comparisons here, just in terms of the numbers of copies. And I looked at Greco-Roman historians and biographers and got the latest data on these authors and how many copies we have. But here's what I want you to filter. You know, if you had, let's say our faith was based on Plato's Republic instead of the New Testament, I'd say we still have a pretty darn good text of Plato's Republic today. So if you're going to have skepticism towards the New Testament, it needs to be multiplied about 1,000 times toward any other classical writing, at least on average. So Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Josephus, Polybius, Pausanias, Herodotus' History, Xenophon's Hellenica. We'll read each one of these in Greek right now, and then there will be a quiz after the break. Okay, Pliny the Elder, we have about 200 copies. He's a 1st century AD author. That's a lot. He's not an average Greco-Roman author. And the oldest substantial one comes 700 years after he wrote. Plutarch, we're waiting 800 years before we get any copies. Josephus, his Antiquities of the Jews, the oldest substantial copy, perhaps only copy, and I haven't done research on this recently, so I may need to update it, I think it's from the 9th century. His Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, mentions Jesus. And that we have more copies of than the other writings because the Christians saw, oh, he's mentioning Jesus, let's make sure we have more copies. And then, of course, they wanted to add to it and say things that Josephus didn't say. But about 20 copies, I understand. Well, what about Herodotus? Herodotus, we'll skip, but it's a nice statue nevertheless. So Polybius, oldest copies, about 1,200 years after he wrote. Pausanias, who wrote the geography of Greece, massive gaps, just whole chapters that are gone. 1,400 years later, we're not exactly sure what he wrote. Then there's Xenophon. And Xenophon wrote his Hellenica. But let me go, I'll come back to Herodotus. I repented of that. His histories, we have 109 manuscripts, but the first substantial manuscripts, more than just a few small papyrus fragments, come 1,500 years after he wrote. Xenophon is even worse. His Hellenica, the first substantial manuscripts, come 1,800 years later. Now, we do have some small scraps before then, but 1,800 years before we get anything substantial from Xenophon of his Hellenica, a very important author. Now, what if that were the situation for the New Testament? What would we compare this to? I have an idea. How about this thing? The first substantial copies of the New Testament, if it was like Xenophon's Hellenica, would have been written when the Wright brothers invented the airplane. You think the skeptics would have a field day then? That's what they think they have. We need to correct them. And by the way, in the correction, make it gentle and always aim to bring them to Christ. You're not trying to win an intellectual argument. You're trying to win hearts and souls for the Lord. Okay, well, these manuscripts, I've mentioned a bunch of copies of the New Testament, but I haven't talked about how old they are. So let me talk about the date of New Testament manuscripts. And this is a simple slide. The next one will be complicated. But let me talk first about the discovery of P-52, which was not the airplane built after the P-51 Mustang in World War II. This stands for Papyrus 52. Let me go back a few years to the year 1844. Some of you looked like you were there then. That was unnecessary. Only wildcats. Okay, so Ferdinand Christian Bauer wrote in the Tübinger Jahrbuch an article in which he argued that the date of John's Gospel must be after AD 160 and probably closer to AD 170. F.C. Bauer was the father of theological liberalism, or the Tübingen school in Germany. And Bauer had been a student of Hegel at the Tübingen University. Hegel, you may remember because we get Hegelian dialectic from him. Now, this is a Saturday morning. You don't want to hear about Hegelian dialectic, so let me put it in simpler terms. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. You all have heard of that. That's Hegelian dialectic. So let me give an illustration. So, father of a teenage girl. Some of you are fathers of teenage girls. The thesis, you will never get a tattoo on your body. The daughter says, I want to get a tattoo on my body. That's the antithesis. The synthesis is she gets a tattoo on her body. So it doesn't always quite work out the way it's supposed to. But what Bauer said is there was a Jewish Christianity and a Gentile Christianity, and they didn't come together where they agreed with each other until after 160. He put John's Gospel at 170, the book of Acts about that same time. What this effectively did, it said there is no historical reliability in John's gospel whatsoever. For the next 90 years, his view reigned supreme. John's gospel was not a first century document and therefore had no historical value. In 1934, 90 years later, a man by the name of C.H. Roberts, a recent doctorate, Dr. Roberts, he'd recently gotten his doctorate, and he was a great paleographer, papyrologist. He worked in ancient papyri. He could date manuscripts. I know that sounds weird. He could... There's always a joke in there sometimes. Let's just skip that. I mean, you know what it's going to be. So, date old leather. No, I'm not going to go there. So anyway, Roberts came across this papyrus that was in a shoebox left by his predecessor at the University of Manchester. And the scholar who left it behind did not have a chance to go through these last few scraps. So Robert sees this thing, and it's about the size of a credit card. And you'll notice, that's the actual size of it, really. No, it's smaller than the palm of my hand. And what Roberts noticed was that this is a pretty decent Greek hand. He also noticed that this was written in a text, a scribe that looked to him for sure like it was from the 2nd century. And on this side, he started to transcribe it. He discovered this as parts of John chapter 18, verses 31 through 33. Then he looked at the backside, and he noticed there was still text there. John chapter 18, verses 37 and 38. The remarkable thing about that was that means this manuscript was from a codex, because scrolls would be written along the horizontal lines on the inside of the fibers. They get these papyrus sheets and put horizontal lines of the natural fibers in the inside. They'd naturally they'd naturally glue to the outside of the vertical lines, and they'd pound it. Then they'd have these long sheets of papyrus that they could make into rolls. This had John 18 on the inside, John 18 just a few verses later on the outside. He was actually able to figure out how many leaves it would take and how big each leaf was for the Gospel of John. That takes a little bit of work to pull that one off. But he looked at this and said, this was written in a codex. He literally, in 1977, wrote the book on the codex called The Birth of the Codex. And he and another fellow, T.C. Skeet, wrote this book where they said the codex form was basically invented sometime in the late 1st century, most likely, but it really didn't take off until the 2nd century. And then they gave some interesting statistics. By the 5th century AD, 500 years after Christianity had been around, 400 years, all of a sudden we discover that 94% of all Christian books through those first 5 centuries were written on a codex. And only something like 14% of all non-Christian books were written on a codex. It was about AD 500 that the whole world started to get caught up on the value of the codex form of books. So mark this down. This is the first and probably the only time in Christian history where the church has been ahead of the technological curve. But we were once, and then you guys have gone retro on us. Robert sent pictures of this fragment to the 3 leading papyrologists in the world, and each one of them independently wrote back to him and said, this manuscript should be dated no later than AD 150 and as early as 100. A fourth, a German, demurred, and he said, I think maybe this was written in the 90s. Well, this got published, his work got published the next year, and one wag even said, well, this copy was made when the ink on the original text of John's Gospel was barely dry. Now, if this manuscript is dated no later than AD 150, I don't know how you learned math and logic here. I know how they learned it in Tucson, but we won't talk about them. But I grew up in Newport Beach, and we probably shouldn't talk about that either, but at least I learned this, that generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not made before the original of the manuscript, right? It makes logical sense. So what this did is it sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. All these books for 90 years argues, first, John's gospel has no historical validity to it, and secondly, it was written after AD 160, probably 170. Now, in the last couple of decades, with the rise of postmodernism, the date of this manuscript has been revised. Maybe it's 125 to 175, maybe even early 3rd century. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 40s, now all of a sudden we see that John's gospel is a thoroughly Jewish document. And so consequently, it's kind of a two-edged sword. With this manuscript and with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we see John's gospel has great historical value. Ironically, the Jesus Seminar that publishes the 5 Gospels, you may have heard of them. They're the ones who did the color-coded beads, and it's before the time of most of you, I think, but they put in red beads in a jar. It said, we believe Jesus actually said these words, and then they'd have Jesus' words in red or in pink if they thought that the idea went back to Jesus. Gray, probably not black. There's no way this is Jesus. That's how they do this. It was called the 5 Gospels because they had the Gospel of Thomas in it. The Gospel of Thomas has more red and pink in it than the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, or the Gospel of Mark. Matthew and Mark are surely 1st century documents. And John, no matter how you date it, must be earlier than the Gospel of Thomas. But because of scholarship's love affair with these apocryphal works, it gets relegated to the back seat. Nevertheless, Bauer's hypothesis of zero historical value to John's gospel, we can certainly say is quite incorrect. This reminds me of a saying of a great scholar, William Lane, that an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. When you talk to your friends, they're going to come up with all sorts of loony ideas. And it's hard to even talk to them. Just ask the question, where's your evidence? Well, I found it on Google. Well, maybe trace it down a little bit further than that. Wikipedia, well, maybe go a little further than that. Anyway, talk about the evidence we have. That's what's on our side. So here's the complicated slide, and I'll go through this real quickly. The Greek New Testament manuscripts century by century. It's not just P52 that is early. We have as many as 12 manuscripts that may be from the 2nd century. It's extraordinarily difficult to date these manuscripts, but it's something along those lines. So all the way through the 10th century, we have at least 967 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek. The next century, that number doubles. Now, there are 4 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the average Greco-Roman author has in 2,000 years. This is just unbelievable data. Within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. We've got a lot of data on our side. So in answer to the first question, now we're about 1/5 through the lecture. Don't put your fingers up yet, Peter. I know, you just make me feel guilty. Has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? Here's another way to look at this. The King James Bible was published in May of 1611, and the Greek New Testament was based essentially on 8 manuscripts, the earliest of which went back to the 11th century. Now, over 400 years later, we have about 5,500 Greek manuscripts. We're just talking about the Greek manuscripts, the earliest of which go back to the 2nd century. So as time goes on, not only do we have almost 1,000 times more manuscripts, we have almost 1,000 years earlier in these manuscripts. The bottom line is we are getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther and farther away, as all these skeptics, one right after the other, seem to say. Does that make sense? Good. Question 1 is done, so if that's as far as we go, I'll be satisfied and you'll be frustrated. So let's talk about what kinds of textual variations there are. Over 99% make virtually no difference at all. Peter Gentry went through a number of these for the Old Testament. Same kind of thing with the New Testament. And spelling is by far the most common textual variant in the New Testament. So common that when Peter Gurry wrote his magnificent article in New Testament Studies, He said, I'm not going to count the spelling variants because it just gets to be a little bit too much. John was a creative speller. He spelled the verb anoigo, which means I open, 3 different ways when it's parsed exactly the same within the space of 8 verses in John chapter 9, I think. Look it up. Neoxen in John 9:14, then go on from there. Third person singular, first aorist, active indicative of anoigo. For you Greek geeks. The rest of you can ignore everything I just said. But what you can't ignore is that we have differences in spelling in these manuscripts, and yet we know that they don't. There. You guys probably understood it the first time, right? I'm picking on you too much, but I'm not done. All right. So, question for Greek geeks and seminary students. How many ways are there to say John loves Mary in Greek? Now, I actually asked myself this question a few years ago. I was teaching a course in Oklahoma City, and I spent 8 hours coming up with the different ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. But here's the things you need to consider. Word order can change all over the map for Greek because it's the inflections, it's the endings that counts. The article occurs with proper names, which means you can say, the John loves the Mary, or John loves the Mary, or the John loves Mary. It goes everywhere. We don't know why these articles are used. What we can say is that the article in Greek, I did my master's thesis on when it does not occur. I did my doctoral dissertation on when it does occur. There's 20,000 of these buggers in the New Testament. 1 out of 7 words is the. And I still don't know why it's used with proper names. Nobody is quite sure. These 2 works, by the way, if you ever wanted to look at them, that I wrote, would cure the most hopeless insomniac. But the article occurs. And then there's differences in spelling for names. For example, the name John can be spelled Ioannes or Ioannes, 1 N or 2. Okay, this will show up on the quiz, so get ready for this. 8 different ways to write John loves Mary. Exactly translated the same, John loves Mary in Greek. Oh, there's another 8. And another lots more. 96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. But there's also conjunctions that are often untranslated. And so let's take a look at how that goes. I can assure you these are all different. I'm pretty anal that way, like Brother Andrew. 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. And yet these are not all the ways to say John loves Mary. I thought, oh, there's a few more. But I decided after 8 hours that I put in my time. Isn't that amazing? Greek is pretty flexible. You say, that's amazing. What's the relevance? We'll get to that. There's other legitimate word orders that swell the numbers to over 500. And just last night I was losing sleep over periphrastic participles. I'm sure you've all done that. And I thought, well, you could say loves this way, and that doubles all these other numbers. A different verb for loves mushrooms the numbers to over 2,000 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek. That's amazing. Okay, here's the relevance. Bart Ehrman says we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the text of the New Testament came to be changed either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. But they would all cure the most hopeless insomniac if we had to discuss those. These are not the kinds of textual variants that are discussed in scholarly meetings because they're just as boring as they could be. If we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times, that was before I did the periphrastic search, over 2,000 times in Greek, without substantially changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. 1.5 million, 10 million, it doesn't matter. What counts is the nature of the variants. And this is where we get to the issue. Less than 1/10 of 1% of all textual variants, that's an important point, are both meaningful and viable. That is, they have meaning, they change the meaning somehow, and they have some plausibility of going back to the original. Both things, meaningful and viable. This is not drawn to scale, the dots should be smaller, but anyway. Let me give you some illustrations of meaningful and viable variants. I'm going to give 2, then I'll just briefly go over 2 because my time is almost up. The first one, Mark chapter 9, verse 29. This is where Jesus' disciples were trying to cast out demons. And they had some particularly pesky demons that just couldn't be exorcised. Jesus said this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting. I put "and fasting" in brackets because not all the manuscripts, in fact, the earliest manuscripts, don't have "and fasting." Now, most scholars would say the exorcism here meant just prayer. The statement ended in prayer, not fasting. And as you can see, just by looking at me, I agree with a shorter reading. But I have been involved in a couple of exorcisms, and I kind of hedge my bet. Maybe I'm wrong about textual criticism. I'm going to fast too. So here's another one that maybe is a more well-known passage. This is one that everybody knows. 666, everybody knows about that. Revelation 13, the only place the number of the beast is mentioned. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast's number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Really? Back in the 1830s and 40s, a scholar discovered in one of the most important manuscripts of the New Testament, I won't give the history of it, but he discovered that this manuscript that had been scraped off and rewritten centuries later, he could read the undertext. It took him 2 years to read 150 leaves of a manuscript. And he discovered that this really important manuscript for the New Testament, and especially Revelation, had the number of the beast as 616. Well, that was the only manuscript we knew of at the time. But then in the last 20 years, another manuscript, an early papyrus, came out from Oxford, where they've got 500,000 papyrus scraps that are waiting to be examined. And one of these has 26 different postage stamp size pieces of this papyrus spanning 9 chapters of Revelation. And one postage stamp is of Revelation 13:18. I had an opportunity to look at both of these manuscripts. One is at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and the other one at Oxford University. And I looked at this manuscript under a magnifying glass and a microphone. A microphone? No, that didn't help. Microscope. That was a verbal variant. So, sure enough, the number of the beast here is 616. So our oldest manuscript for Revelation 13:18 and one of our 2 most important manuscripts for the book of Revelation both have the number of the beast as 616. Now, if you ask me, what's the number of the beast? I'll say it depends what day it is. Tuesdays, I kind of think it's 616. Thursdays, 666. I mean, really, I don't know. But what this has done, I mean, I'm the editor of the Net Bible, senior New Testament editor of the Net Bible, a new translation. And if we decide to publish another edition and I decide to let my carnal side come out and put as the number of the beast 616, it will send about 7 tons of popular Christian literature to the flames. Most scholars would say 666, that's the number of the beast. 616, that's just the neighbor of the beast. He lives a few doors down, you know. But here's the thing. I know of no Bible college, no theological seminary, no denomination, no church that puts in their doctrinal statement, we believe in the virgin birth of Christ, we believe in the deity of Christ, we believe in the sinlessness of Christ, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It may be meaningful, both variants are meaningful and viable, but it doesn't rise to that level. The 2 longest textual variants are Mark 16, 9 through 20, you know about picking up snakes, handling snakes, drinking poison, this kind of thing. I won't get into the text, but most scholars don't think these passages are authentic. What do we lose if we lose these 12 verses? There's only 2 passages, 2 textual variants that involve more than 2 verses, and they are both 12 verses long. The long ending of Mark's gospel is one of them. What do we lose if these verses are not authentic? Well, if they are authentic, we might lose an arm, but no, that was not kind. I shouldn't. That's just. Let's do this instead. The other one that almost all of us want to have in our Bible is the story of the woman caught in adultery. Bart Ehrman loves to say this is a passage that's not found in the earliest manuscripts, probably didn't happen. And I want to tell you that most scholars today believe that the story of the woman caught in adultery was almost surely not written by John. But most, or at least many scholars believe that doesn't mean it was not historically true. It ends up floating all over the Gospels. There's a half a dozen different places it ends up in. And I've seen some fascinating manuscripts that it was left out of one, so a pastor just angrily wrote it in and put it into a paper leaf and stitched it into the parchment to say, "You fool, you left out my favorite passage." And I call it my favorite passage that's not in the Bible. But what do we lose? What do we lose if we lose the story of the woman caught in adultery? Is this the only place that Jesus shows tenderness to women? Is it the only place that he forgives sins? It's an example. It's a great illustration. And I think in large part it happened historically, but I don't think John wrote it. So what we lose are some anecdotes, but not foundational issues. Question 3, what theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? I'm coming back to Dan Brown in his Da Vinci Code, and Sir Lee Teabing says to Sophie, "My dear, until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless immortal." That time in history, that moment, was the Council of Nicaea in 325, when allegedly Constantine invented the deity of Christ. That's what Dan Brown believes. That's what some of these Muslim apologists believe. 4th century, finally Jesus gets to be God. Really? Let me show you an ounce of evidence again. This is papyrus number 66, dated right around AD 200. Read along with me if you will. This is John chapter 1. I'll just translate because of time. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Have you ever heard it read that way? This is 125 years before the Council of Nicaea. How could that possibly be if Constantine invented the deity of Christ? Because he didn't invent the deity of Christ. Every single manuscript of John's gospel, no matter the date or the language, says virtually the same thing. In John 1:1, Jesus is unequivocally called God. The same can be said for the major passages that affirm Christ's deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, his death on a cross, bodily resurrection, and his second coming. There are no passages where you get a denial of these things. You might not have an affirmation, but the lack of an affirmation is not the same thing as a denial. And that's really important to point out. King James has an extra verse on the deity of Christ here, but that doesn't mean that the other translations don't recognize and admit and strongly affirm the deity of Christ. That makes sense to you? Very, very important. Question 4. Has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? I put that up too quick, but I've already been told, get off the stage now. So, Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was a paleographer extraordinaire and the principal librarian of the British Museum, 80 years ago, had this to say. Brilliant scholar, published 3 of the most important papyri of the New Testament in the world. And he said, the general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the scriptures and our conviction, listen to the wording carefully, that we have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable Word of God. That's what you have in your hands. Maybe not in all of the particulars, but in substantial integrity, we have the veritable Word of God in our hands today. But don't take Kenyon's word for it. I'll quote that other fine evangelical, or former evangelical, Bart Ehrman. His hardback came out first 2005. 6 months later, they wanted to add a paperback, and they added an appendix for some editor's notes to kind of beef up the sales. And so I'm pointing out that this is on page 252. Get the paperback version, you'll see it. They asked him this question. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy? Oops. I almost blew the whole thing here. Okay, one more time. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Notice, These people who edited and published his book did not ask him, do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy are in jeopardy? They asked him, why do you believe? The way they read his book, yes, of course he believes that. When confronted with this specific question, here's what he said. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. That's profound. Bart Ehrman, the number one guy who is the skeptic about the text of the New Testament, was able to say this because the evidence could not allow him to say otherwise. So let me close with an unnatural segue. Just before lunch, this will fit, and I don't think you'll see these in Arizona very often. But a polar bear attacks a man in Canada, and bystanders do nothing. The media did not even report this incident, liberal media, of course. Up in Canada, where these two scholars are, I'm not sure why that's liberal, but I had to say that. Okay, this is true. A polar bear attacked a man in Canada. I want you to close your eyes right now and envision what this looks like. Now, for some of you who are a little bit queasy, this may be rated PG-13, maybe rated R, but just close your eyes. Everybody done that? Okay, here we go. Now take a look. That's not the response I expected from a polar bear attacking a man. The polar bear attacking the man, this is a parable, is the variance to the text of the New Testament. The New Testament are his 501 blues, his Levi's. Did it affect him? Did this polar bear hurt him? In fact, we should say the text is actually his leg and the jeans are just the cover for it. But the fact is, even these attacks on the New Testament that we might call these hundreds of thousands of differences among the variants do not affect the substantial integrity of the Word of God. And that you can take to the bank. Thank you.